Hi folks, and welcome. We're going to learn some basic concepts in this lecture that are going to take you through the semester. Specifically in this lecture, we're going to learn some basic terms and definitions, and we're also going to talk about a history of sociology in the West. Now, your textbook in the first half of Chapter 1 does talk about history of sociology. However, I'm going to go into some more detail with regard to the West specifically, because that's where we're going to concentrate our efforts this semester, in that group of nations that we call the West. All right, so let's get a start. First, we need to know what sociology is. And realistically, sociologists are people who really want to ask a lot of questions about social behavior. We want to know, why do we act differently in different situations? This tells us, when we ask this kind of question, that behavior is social. If we act differently around different groups of people and in different situations, then there has to be some element outside of us as the individual that is influencing that behavior, and we want to try to get to what that element is. And two basic questions that we ask are, first, why do we feel connected to others? What are the components in a society that bind us together? What are the things that help a society to function or work in a smooth way? And the other question that we have opposes that one. Why do we feel disconnected from other people? What are the elements that cause a society to dysfunction? Or what are the components that cause us to be working at odds with other people and with other groups? So if you've never had a sociology course before, I'll bet you've had a psychology course. And I want to take a minute now just to point out the difference between these two disciplines. So in psychology classes, or if we go see a therapist, we're looking at the study of our mental health. And the focus for a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist, counselor, is inside of your head, looking at those mental processes that are happening inside of you that are driving your behavior. Sociology takes an opposing point of view. Now, these disciplines are very complementary to each other, and in fact, there are specialists who devote their careers to both fields, social psychologists. But in the field of sociology, we really are studying the individual and society at the same time. So our focus here is outside the head. And we want to concentrate on how social interactions, how the things that we do when we're surrounded by other people influence and drive our behavior. So you can see where the differences are in these two disciplines. Again, very complementary, but quite distinctly different from each other. So sociology defined: the systematic study of society and social interaction. And sociologists, whether we like what we're doing or not, study all aspects of society. You know, we do try to, most of us I think, specialize in studies that are interesting to us, that we have some desire to learn about. But it doesn't really matter whether or not we like what we're studying. We do study everything about society. And when we do that, we always use some type of scientific process or method to study the real world, whether that's the scientific process that you are familiar with since about the second grade, or whether it's a type of interpretive framework. We use recognized processes and procedures, and then we apply that science to study the real world, to study our real environment. Now, I should take a minute here to clarify a couple of words. The word society and the word culture, and these mean two different things. When we talk about society, we're talking about a group which interacts together, resides together, and shares a unique culture. When we're talking about culture, we're talking about that group's practices, values, or beliefs. So, culture is embedded in a society, and a society is a group who shares that embedded culture. As we get further along in the semester, you're going to want to remember so that you can distinguish these two terms from each other. So really, when we study society, sociologists are looking for cultural patterns, and we're looking for how those patterns are influenced. Are they influenced by social pressures from within that particular society, that group, or are they influenced by external conditions, things that are happening around the group? There have been some very interesting studies over the years about what happens to a group when it feels threatened by outsiders. And so that's an example of those external conditions at play. Early in chapter 1, you hear this term figuration. And this is a term that was used by a sociologist by the name of Norbert Elias. And he said essentially that the individual and society are inseparable. And it brings up this concept of figuration. Defined, figuration is the process of analyzing individual behaviors and social influences at the same time. He says we can't have just individual behavior, and we can't have just the influence of society on the individual. And this highlights what we in sociology call the problem of order, also sometimes called the problem of social order. But essentially here we ask a question. The question we ask is, does the structure influence the individual, or does the individual influence the structure? And we talk about these in terms of the macro and the micro level of analysis. Now we'll get to that a little bit more later, these concepts of macro and micro. But really what Elias was trying to ask was, why do we behave? Not how do we behave, but why are we behaving the way we are behaving? Is this because of our own personal morals and values, or do we behave the way we behave because we've internalized social norms and positive and negative sanctions? And it's an interesting question. And the answer that we come up to is it's both of those things. The individual influences the bigger picture and helps to create social norms and sanctions, and then in turn the individual creates their own personal set of morals and values that they bring into society. So there's a relationship there between the macro level and the micro level. It's not always about the structure influencing the individual, or vice versa, the individual influencing the structure. Talking now a little bit about the history of sociology, particularly when we're talking about the West, early thinking of those social philosophers was motivated by a desire to describe what they called an ideal society. Now, realistically, ideals can't exist, right? We know that they are something that we imagine in our head. They are perfect conditions, but in reality, we can never have perfect conditions. And so what these early thinkers were trying to describe was their recognition that there were problems out there in the real world. And these problems were things that people had to deal with on a daily basis. And this means that they recognized also then a desire for social reform. What can we do to make conditions better for most people? Now, these early thinkers actually thought we could achieve an ideal. They thought that we could, if we just manipulated things enough, or if we just reformed society enough, we could do away with all kinds of social ills, and we could live in an ideal world. I think you and I both know that that's not achievable. There are always going to be problems, particularly as we become much more complex as groups of people, as societies. So talking a little bit about the history of sociology in the West, this is not to diminish those other scholars, academics, and philosophers who came before, but our focus in this class is going to be on the West. Now, the first thing we really should do is talk about what I mean when I'm talking about the West. So there are two different definitions that you'll need to keep in mind. The first one is the West from a historical perspective. All right, so just taking into account what the world looked like or looks like today, we know the West in a historical sense as a specific geographic region of the world. So we're talking about a group of countries that resided in close proximity to each other and that shared some ideas or ideals about how things should be run, the purpose of the government, what different groups of people should be doing. These particular countries were at roughly the same sort of development as each other. And so when we talk about the West from a historical perspective, we're talking about this part of the world right here. We're talking about specific countries, Spain, Portugal, Britain, Ireland. We're talking about the Scandinavian countries. We're talking about Germany, France, Italy, and so forth. So a very, very isolated, specific region of the world that held a lot of power and whose social philosophers were beginning to think about the world in very similar ways. Now, when we talk about the West contemporarily, we talk about it in slightly different terms. So not only do we encompass that geographic region of the West that used to be the historical West, but now we talk about the West being an overarching set of values that govern the way these countries behave. So we can include some additional countries. We can include Canada, we can include the United States, we can include Japan, Australia, and many other countries. So now when we talk about the West, we're not just talking about a specific geographic region. We are instead talking about an overarching set of cultural values that the people in those countries tend to adhere to or abide by. And that's an important distinction, so that's something that you're going to want to keep in mind as we move through the semester. All right, now there were three events talking historically about the West here. There were three events that led to the creation of sociology as an academic discipline. And those three events were the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution. And so I want us to talk about these three events or periods of time individually so that we can understand the influence of each of these things on the creation of the field of sociology in the West. All right, let's talk about the Enlightenment now. Again, we're talking about the West with a capital W here from a historical perspective. We're talking about a time frame around the 1600s to the 1800s in this lecture. However, it's important for us to remember that when we're talking about time, it's not like somebody flipped a switch and things started on the first day of the 1600s and ended on the last day of the 1800s with regard to the Enlightenment. So we're talking about a general time frame here. In the early parts of the Enlightenment, progressive social development was one of the keys to new ways of thinking. There was a break from the Catholic Church, which was extremely oppressive at that time, and we came out of the age of mysticism, which means that we did things because we felt like there was a supernatural being guiding whether we should do them or not. And under the thumb of feudal rule, we started to move away from that. We started to move away from the rule of nobles. Now we have to think about what life might have been like back in the day. We're coming out of the feudal system. We're creating new ways to interact with each other. But during the feudal system, particularly during the latter years of it, we had a system that wasn't working for a lot of people. And we really only had two groups of people, and they related to each other with regard to how much power or how little power they had. We had a group of nobles, and those nobles ruled everybody else. And those nobles were very, very closely tied to the church, and the church was very, very closely tied to the government. And so what we ended up with in this system was in many places a very oppressive system. We had groups of people who had no power. We can call them peasants, we can call them serfs, we can call them slaves, but these people had little control over their own personal destiny. And the people who did have control over them could be oppressive. Doesn't mean that everybody was, but it wasn't a good system for most, because most people had no power over their own lives. Most people lived on someone else's property, in someone else's house, and as long as they tended to that property, whatever that job was, whether it was harvesting crops or taking care of animals, as long as they did a good job at that and they were productive, they could stay on that land. But it's important for us to realize that it was their labor that was making that land productive, yet they didn't reap any rewards from that labor. In other words, you can go out and tend those crops, but you're not going to make any money from them. You might have a roof over your head, you might have enough to eat, and you might have a relatively stable home life, but you were never going to be able to make something for yourself and your family, because all of the profit from your labor went to the person who owned the land on which you lived, that noble. Whether it was a duke or a count or whoever it was doesn't really matter, but that person derived profit from your labor. And so what ended up happening here was it kept that working class of people who didn't have any power in that place. They didn't have a lot of social mobility. So in the Enlightenment, they started to question, these early social philosophers started to question why we were doing things that way. Why are we following authority even when we recognize it might not be beneficial to us? And essentially, it's because we had always done things that way. We had always been told that our reward would come in heaven and that we had to follow the rules, and the rules were ordained by the church, and the church was part of the government, and all of this stuff was ordained by God. And to go against these ideas about your place in society could really get you into trouble. You could be jailed, and in some places that would be considered heresy. You could be killed for it. These early philosophers, though, started to have some new ideas about what society should be like. And this is when science first starts to get a foothold in the West, so to speak, because science gives us reason. And we start to question that social order, and we start to think about things in a more objective kind of way. And this is a foundational idea to the field of sociology. Sociology is not on the map yet in the West, but the Enlightenment, particularly those early ways of thinking in a different kind of way, set the stage for sociology to become an academic discipline. The second thing that we want to talk about is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the West has had their Industrial Revolution, but it's important for us to acknowledge that there are still many industrial revolutions going on in countries around the world. China, India, and many other countries are in the throes of their own industrial revolution now. This is causing problems for us worldwide because we have such a large population now, particularly in China and India, that we're causing problems today with industrial revolutions that we didn't cause 200, 300, 400 years ago. Now, it can be argued that we did start to pollute the world with our Western Industrial Revolution in ways that we had never really polluted the world before because of the invention of the steam engine. The steam engine was the invention that drove the Industrial Revolution for the West. And some interesting things start to happen in the West because of that. Urban centers start to pop up, and these urban centers were usually very far away from where most people lived. Remember, most people were living in rural environments, maybe small villages, small groups of people, but realistically none of them lived close to a big city because really big cities were few and far between, and they didn't have a reason to exist with large populations until the Industrial Revolution started. And so what starts to happen is these urban centers and factories start to pop up, and there's a need now for mass labor. And you better bet if you lived on someone else's property that the idea of having a job and getting a paycheck was probably pretty attractive to you. So initially, nobles really had a hard time trying to keep these people living on the farm in their place. Now remember, you didn't really have the ability to just pick up and go. Your life really wasn't your life. You belonged to the people who had power in your society. But this becomes a losing battle for the nobles, because over time so many people flock to these urban centers in the hopes of having a job and a little bit of control over their destiny, that it really becomes too much for the nobles to try and keep them on the property. And so the feudal system starts to crumble and a new system comes in to take its place. And that system is capitalism. And what are some of those early things that start to happen in those urban centers, in those factories? Well, it's an interesting thing. Working conditions were very, very poor. There were no worker protections like we have today. Your work day could have been 16 hours a day. It might have been 7 days a week. You might have rarely gotten any time off to eat lunch or have a break. And so we didn't have those kinds of rules in place that govern how you go to work and do your job today. Back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, all of the power was held by the people who owned what we call the means of production. The people who owned the factories, the people who owned the equipment, the people who owned the buildings had all of the power over the workers. But nonetheless, people see this as an opportunity. They see it as a vastly different system from the system of feudalism. Incomes do start to rise, populations in these urban centers increase, but as I said, working conditions are not good. Living conditions in general are not good in these early urban centers. So let's think about this in a logical way. If the people who are farming move away from the farm and they move into the city and they take different jobs, we're going to strain the food source. Now you have to think about technology also. We weren't yet technologically advanced enough to have super farms where it was really easy to farm them because you had machinery to do the jobs. Farming was still very much manual labor. And so the food sources in the city start to really get strained as these populations increase due to the influx of people coming in from the farm. Shanty towns start to pop up because there's a lack of housing. Child mortality rates, interestingly, go up. So if you lived in a rural environment and you were a child, you had a better chance at survival than if you lived in the city. But inverse to that, infant mortality rates in the city start to drop. So if you lived on a farm and you were between the ages of birth to 1, you had a higher chance of death than if you lived in the city. And what's driving those statistics? Well, with child mortality rates, it's because children worked in the factories and they could fit where adults could not fit, into machinery to repair it, into coal mines where adults could not go. And so this drove up the child mortality rate. Infant mortality rates, however, began to drop because in the city you might have had access to a midwife or a doctor if you needed it during childbirth. If your child was sick during the first year of its life, you may have been able to get medicine for that child, or at least have that child seen by a doctor or a nurse who could determine what was wrong and nurse the child back to health. Nonetheless, conditions are deteriorating quickly in the city, but 3 things happen at that early onset of the Industrial Revolution in the West, and it's really important that you can distinguish between these 3 things. As a result of these really bad conditions in the city, a lot of people start thinking maybe capitalism isn't right either. And so socialism gets a foothold. Now this is a political or economic system, and socialism emerges as a criticism of the problems with early capitalism. Those early socialists said, look people, you're just replacing one system of oppression, feudalism, with another system of oppression, capitalism. But this was a hard sell for those early socialists because a lot of people did have more opportunities when they got into the city in the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. You know, if you were in a family and your family worked in a factory and you could save some money, you might have been able to go out on your own and start up that business and move your family up the social ladder. The Industrial Revolution allowed a middle class to grow, and so it wasn't bad for everybody, but there were some people at the beginning who kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, this is a system that's probably not going to be able to sustain itself long term. Another thing that happens is the field of social work, which is a profession where people go out into the streets and help people live their lives. They offer counseling, they offer assistance, and social workers are hands-on practitioners that help people to better their circumstances or conditions. And that's distinctly different from sociology, which is the academic discipline that studies society and behavior. Sociology comes after social work because those early social workers were aghast at some of the conditions that they saw in this urban environment. And they began to write about what they were seeing, these conditions that they were noting. And so those social philosophers of the Enlightenment came along and started writing also about some of these things that were happening due to the shift in population, due to the Industrial Revolution, and due to the changes in conditions around the individual. I want you to imagine what it might have been like if you had lived on someone else's farm in the middle of nowhere. You might have known 50 people in your lifetime, 100 people in your lifetime, and your family picks up and goes into the city. And now you're surrounded by thousands of people who you don't know, who don't know you, and who come from different places with different ideas about how things should be run. And so this causes a lot of chaos in those early cities, and it calls for the need for recognition of that chaos. And that's where sociology kind of comes into play. It is an academic, research-oriented discipline where those early philosophers wanted to take note of what was happening and ask the government to assist. So social workers go out and get their hands dirty. Generally speaking, those early sociologists didn't do that. And so that's just a little brief recap of the Industrial Revolution. Now let's move on to the French Revolution. So we're going to talk about the period of time from about 1789 to about 1799, so about 10 years. And prior to that, that period of time was really known as what we call the decadence of the aristocracy. This was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and he was an extremely ineffective king. He always wanted people to tell him what to do. He didn't make a lot of decisions on his own, and his advisors influenced him to make some very bad decisions for the commoners, what were called the Third Estate. And taxes became extremely high to support the lifestyle of the nobles. Now you know what that life was like. Extravagant outfits, extravagant parties every night, extravagant palaces to live in, never having to want for anything. But in order to support that way of living, more and more taxation was happening to those urban people who lived in the cities. Now, if we talk specifically about Paris, which was the biggest urban center in France at that time, some interesting things happened. Now remember, your population is moving from the farm into the city. You have too much work for rural people, therefore. The ones that remained on the farm couldn't keep up with the amount of work they needed to do to get crops harvested on time and to get those crops shipped into the cities. And so what starts to happen is the urbanites are starting to get pretty hungry because they're not getting enough food into the city. As taxes start to grow on the group of urban people, businesses start shuttering their doors because they can't stay afloat. And so you've got really interesting conditions now going on inside these cities. You've got no work and you've got no food. And then there are a couple of really bitter winters back to back. in the French countryside where the food production is taking place. Now it snows in France, it regularly snows, but these winters were blizzard-like conditions that literally took down whatever crops there were. And so now your food supply is extremely strained. And you're living in the city, and you're looking at Louis and Marie and their court of people, and you're thinking to yourself, why am I living like this? You know, if you lived in a rural environment and you didn't have food, you could go hunt. You knew how to do that. Or you could forage. You knew how to do that. But now you're living in the city, and you've essentially been cut off from your ability to find your own food. And the stores are shuttering, and the food supply is strained. And this is what starts the French Revolution, essentially. Looking at the aristocracy and seeing that they are living a life that is way beyond extravagant, and you living a life that is bordering on subsistence. You could die because of the lack of food. And so the French people took to the streets, and they stormed the Bastille. Now I know you've heard this term before, storm the Bastille. Now the Bastille was a French prison, and it became the symbol of oppression for the French commoners who lived in the city at that time. They saw the Bastille as everything that was wrong with society, and they decided that they were going to take it over. And so this phrase, storm the Bastille, is symbolic of them taking to the streets with whatever they had, whether it was pitchforks or knives or bats, whatever it was, and storming the Bastille and taking it away from the guard, from Louis's guards. And as they fought for the Bastille, they did indeed run the guards away, and they were so incensed, so outraged, that they began to take the Bastille down brick by brick. And so they had won the first round, so to speak. Now, as the French Revolution wore on, what happens is something very interesting. As the revolution unfolds in the city of Paris, Louis and Marie lose their power, essentially. And this is the end of aristocracy. This is the end of noble rule in France. So when the commoners take over the Bastille, they essentially overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic. However, it doesn't turn out to be a government for the people, by the people, initially. After the Bastille comes the Reign of Terror, and the Reign of Terror happens because the new republic, the new government that gets installed, turns out to be oppressive also. They start to order mass executions to restore civil authority, and they start to round up people who might be thinking against or speaking against the new revolutionary government. And so it's a period of 10 years of time in France that is extremely traumatic to most people, and a very, very dangerous place for people to be. Both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded towards the end of the French Revolution. So after the Bastille and then after the Reign of Terror, eventually France is transformed into a democratic, secular type of society where freedom from religion was installed in the government, and some other interesting things happened also. Civil rights for Black people, civil rights for Jews, decriminalization of same-sex relationships. So in some respects, the French were very, very forward-thinking in the latter part of the French Revolution. Now, on the cusp of the 1800s, along comes the first bona fide sociologist in the West, and his name is Auguste Comte. And he's theorizing about how the French Revolution had played itself out. And he comes up with an early theory about how societies evolve through three stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and the scientific. And really, this early theory of Comte is essentially how sociology gets itself on the map. He says, theological countries or societies are what we could consider to be a pre-Enlightenment type of society, where people do things because they're told to do them and they don't question whether or not it's morally right or wrong. He says the second stage is when we have the Enlightenment period. And he says here is where we start to question authority, and we start to believe that universal human rights are very important, and we start to question whether authority is doing what is right for people, for society. He sees France as being in this metaphysical stage after the French Revolution. He sees them as moving towards the scientific. And he thought that science was going to provide answers to all kinds of social problems. And here we come back to that idea of the social ideal, the ideal society. He thought that if we could use science to fix the problems society was having, we could eventually eliminate all kinds of social ills. So Comte was pretty popular because of this theory, and he establishes sociology as a discipline in the university in Paris, and from there it spreads throughout the West. So even though he wasn't the first person to use the term sociology, he was the first person to use this term in the West. But it's interesting to note also that towards the end of his career, he went a little bit crazy and insisted that people call him the Pope of Positivism. Now, positivism was one of his ideas, and defined positivism means the application of science to the study of society. And Comte thought that if we used science to study what was going on in the world with people, we could allow for objectivity, and we could also generalize those findings. Now, we're going to learn about generalization in a future lecture. But when we're talking about objectivity, what we're talking about is we can figure out why people are doing what they're doing in a measurable kind of way. So Auguste Comte really thought that if we could go out and we could get a good sample of what was going on in the world by observing people doing a specific thing or acting a specific way or thinking about things in a certain way, that we could take those results and say this was a general condition of society. And we'll talk more about why that can and cannot work when we start talking about how we do sociological research. So Auguste Comte's biggest contribution, early 1800s, theorizes about why the French Revolution happened, comes up with his 3 stages of society, and coins the term sociology, getting sociology on the map and linking science to the study of society with his concept of positivism. But not so fast, because then along comes Max Weber. Now, Max Weber was a German sociologist, and he comes a little bit behind Auguste Comte. He's kind of on the heels of Auguste Comte, and he studied Comte's work, but he doesn't really agree with what Comte was saying. And he comes up with what we would call antipositivism. And instead of looking for objective criteria that we can measure, Max Weber comes along and he says it's not enough just to bean count. We have to understand why people are doing what they're doing. We need to look for those subjective meanings that are driving people's behavior. So for Comte, the object of sociology was to predict how society would behave by observing a handful of people and how they behaved. But for Weber, the object of sociology was to understand why people were behaving a particular way. And this is the German term Verstehen. Verstehen translated means understanding. So Max Weber and Auguste Comte were kind of at odds with each other with their approaches to how to study society. So as a comparison, let's take a look here. Positivism is said to be objective, looking only at data, and has a high level of generalizability, meaning that if I take a sample, I can say those results are generally going to hold true for that bigger population from which I draw my sample. Positivism tends to be quantitative, meaning it's numerical in form, and we use statistics to figure out the results of a data set. On the other side is antipositivism, looking beneath the data to figure out why people are doing what they're doing. And these are very individualized reasons for behavior. And so in this case, we cannot generalize our findings. We can't say that what drives one person to behave a specific way is going to apply to most people in a society or a group. And generally speaking, this type of data tends to be what we call qualitative, meaning that it's descriptive in form and it is very highly personalized. All right, folks, let's go back to the beginning. In this lecture, we covered two important things. We covered some basic terms and definitions to carry you through the semester. We also covered a history of sociology in the West. We defined the term sociology. We defined the term culture. We defined the term figuration, and we talked about what an ideal society is. We talked about the West with a capital W, both from a historical perspective and from a contemporary point of view. We talked about the three events that got sociology on the map in the West: the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution. Now, I'm not going to hold you to specific dates. However, you do have to have a general idea of when things were happening in order to understand them. So just keep that in mind for this course. We talked about rural versus urban populations. We talked about science and how it connected to the Enlightenment. We talked about how populations shifted with the Industrial Revolution. We talked about feudal systems versus capitalist systems. We also talked about making a distinction between social work, sociology, and socialism. We talked about some of the different characteristics of those early urban centers during the early Industrial Revolution in the West. We talked about the contributions of Auguste Comte and Max Weber, specifically positivism and antipositivism. That's a lot, I know. Most of the lectures will not be this long. However, because this was the first, we covered a lot of information that's going to lay the groundwork for the rest of this semester. All right, let me know if you have any questions by using your discussion board in the module. Take care. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.